Okay, we're starting today on 29:17, Isaiah, and let's begin with a short prayer. Father, we ask your assistance in the Philippines as the people are recovering from the terrible hurricane and tornado they had over there, that they may recover from it and that maybe less people will have died from it than they presume. We ask this in the name of Jesus, our Lord. 29:17. I remember we're talking about now he talked about hypocritical worship, and then he begins to talk about the fact that he's going to restore the world. And he says, in just a little while, will not Lebanon become a fertile land, and the fertile land taken to be a forest? And Lebanon is a fertile land, but beforehand, the condemnation on Lebanon was that it would dry up and become like a desert and be abandoned. So this is the restoration. The word Lebanon, I think, actually means garden. But it's a very, very, what do you call productive land. And it's not mainly from rain. It's mainly from the fogs that come off the Mediterranean. But anyway, it's a very fertile area. And I think you know the trees there, the Cedars of Lebanon. Well, a cedar causes the stuff to condense, and it comes down in rain. So that's the way their thing works. And I should mention the reason the Cedars of Lebanon were so famous is, first of all, they're what we know as aromatic red cedar. They're the red cedar. And the second thing is they grow, they're absolutely straight. And at that time in history, anyone who built ships, masts, were all from Lebanon, from the cedars in Lebanon. That made the area very wealthy. He says, that day the deaf will hear the words of the book, and free from shadow and darkness, the eyes of the blind will see. You see why this is seen as a prophecy with regards to Jesus, because of the people who are cured of blindness. But he says, the deaf will hear the words of a book, and the eyes of the blind will see. And we see both those kinds of cures in Jesus's background. But what he's talking about there, again, is the restoration of the land. So the restoration of the land implies the restoration of the people. Both of these, both blindness and the hearing, are things that come to people mainly in aging in the Mideast. I think I've told you, if you go over there, the number of blind people in the Mideast is astronomical. And it's not people born blind. In fact, I think you notice in the scriptures, Jesus will only encounter one person born blind. He encounters a lot of blind people, but only one person born blind. And it's because of the sanitation and what's carried in the dust, because it's dry over there. He says, the lowly will once more find joy in the Lord, and the poorest of people will delight in the Holy One of Israel. And this idea of the poor, this is one of the things that I think governments have real trouble understanding. But if you take care of the poor, then everyone is taken care of. It works up. Like oftentimes, I think Ronald Reagan was the advocate of trickle-down economics. And it doesn't quite work. But it does work when the poor have money, because when the poor have money, they spend it. And so it seems to work. And so in any society, if you want to know the health of the society, you look at the poor. Okay? And that's the horror in this country. Anyone who visits this country, the amount of homeless in this country is just horrendous. And I think, we see it worse here, Because if you're going to be homeless, you want to be homeless in California or Florida. You don't want to be homeless in Minnesota, So we see a lot more of that here. He says, "For the oppressor will be no more. The scoffer will have vanished, and all those alert to do evil will be destroyed. Those who cause people to sin by a word, those who lay traps for the arbitrator at the gate and pervert the cause of righteousness." And what he's talking about here is that you can end up in a system, and this was very common in the ancient world. You could end up in a system where actually the only people who got anything out of the court system and stuff was the rich. And it was always done by bribes. Now, in our country, and actually in most of the first world, it's interesting that the courts are dominated by the rich as well, but it's because of the lawyers. Like if you're the wealthiest person, you can afford an excellent lawyer. And I think one of the things, if you're a person who's interested in court cases or watches them, there are lawyers, I swear, could get a Benedict Arnold off. They're wonderful, wonderful lawyers. And so the rich end up using the courts to their advantage. And that's another thing to notice in a society, how that would be done. I don't know if you've ever studied much about the Soviet Union, but the Soviet system attempted to kind of overcome that. And what is the difference between the Soviet system and our system? I mean, other than the things you'd notice, but philosophically, in our system, we have representatives in the government elected by territories. So we have representatives from San Luis Obispo, we have representatives of California and that sort of stuff, and the Senate and the House of Representatives. In a Soviet, you don't do that. In a Soviet, it has to do with work. So like, for instance, you have so many representatives from the military, so many representatives from the carpenters' union, so many representatives from the doctors' union. What we call unions, they call Soviets. And so these different amalgams of different kinds of professions, and they represent, and they hoped in that it would sort of work out the system and everything. But one of the things that I think it is very difficult for people to understand is that for a system to work, any system, it has to presume on the goodwill of the people. And if the people don't have the goodwill, the best system in the world doesn't work. People who don't have goodwill use the system for their benefit, period. That's just the kind of the way it works. So, he says, "Therefore, thus says the Lord God of the house of Jacob, Abraham's Redeemer, no more shall Jacob be ashamed, no more shall his face grow pale." The idea here is that Jacob, of course, would be ashamed of having been defeated and lost Israel and all that sort of thing. But it's interesting to imagine what it would be in heaven that no one will be ashamed. I think that it's a curious thing to me, because I think people will have a real knowledge of one another. And I doubt if there's anyone, certainly no one I've ever met, who doesn't have something in their life to be ashamed of, and are just delighted that we didn't live in the day when everyone recorded everything and put it on the internet. But the idea is that somehow in heaven, none of us will have anything to be ashamed of, no matter what our life is or anything. And I'm not really sure how that will grow. He says, "For when his children see the work of my hands in their midst, they will hallow my name. They will hallow the Holy One of Jacob, and they will hold the God of Israel in awe. The perverted in spirit will learn understanding, and murmurers accept instruction. And so he says that, they'll have this renovation and everything, but the perverted in spirit will learn understanding. And what he's saying here is that people of a perverted spirit, like, I guess malicious people and stuff, he says that basically they lack understanding of how things work. And I look at, like the United States, that, it is to our benefit that a lot of social systems exist. So that, like, if you come into a country where only the wealthy can get medical assistance, well, then you have a lot of sick people around in your society, and that's not good for the wealthy. That's not good for anyone, okay? I don't know if you have ever heard the story. Do you know they had a plague of leprosy in San Francisco? I think it was in about the 1860s, 1870s, and it took them about 2 years to figure out what was causing it. And the only way you can get leprosy is if someone with leprosy communicates it to you through a wound. Like, for instance, if someone has leprosy and I wrestle with them, I'm not going to get leprosy unless I have a cut somewhere, okay? So they connected it with the Chinese, and they were trying to find out where it was. And actually it was a cook in a restaurant. And the thing is, no one sees the cook. He's behind the thing. And the reason it took so long is that if all of us were to go in that restaurant, the only one of us who would get leprosy is someone who had an ulcer. Because you have to have an open wound, okay? Even if the leprosy is all over the place, you have to have an open wound to get the leprosy. And you may know that Damien in Molokai got a shaving. He nicked himself, and leprosy was all over the island. But anyway, the idea, it took them a long time to find it. But there are things like this that he says that if people understand it, the perverted in spirit, if they understand it, then they will begin to change. And I'm not sure. It seems to me there are some people that are just malicious, and I don't know if understanding is going to help them. But anyway, it says and murmurers will accept instruction, and the idea again is the murmurers are the people who spread gossip and these theories. What do they call them?
Conspiracy?
What?
Conspiracy?
Yeah, the conspiracy theories are an example of that. The curious thing about, one of the things I loved when I was studying philosophy, there were certain things in philosophy that were ideas presented by a philosopher that were absolutely stark raving mad, but there was no way to disprove it. And that's kind of like the what do you call it, the theories that they oftentimes there's no way. There was a German, I'm not sure who, might have been Leibniz or something, but anyway, they maintain monads. And what he said, that each one of us is an individual, and everything around us, everything is just a projection of ourselves. Like, none of you exist. You are the projection of me into how I construct the world and everything. And they say everyone is that way. But you see, the only way you can argue against it is fallacious, because I just made you up anyway. So how could your argument matter, you know? And so it's just a fascinating thing. But he says that they will accept instruction, and when they accept instruction, they will do this. one of the things that is very strong in this passage, and I think it's from the wisdom literature, that there is a thought among people that the better educated a person is, the better they will be, because they will understand how these different things work and stuff like that. That actually doesn't necessarily work out, okay? But that's the theory. And I think you know that in the 19th century, that was one of the great things. As soon as we get everyone educated, then they'll be better. As soon as we get everyone, with different background stuff. And it actually doesn't work that way, I don't think. So anyway, he talks about the next in 30, the failure of an alliance with Egypt. In the scriptures, he kind of warns them against having an alliance with Egypt. Although if you remember earlier, we saw a passage that one day Israel and Egypt would be at peace with one another and this sort of thing. And many in the Mideast regard the treaty made by Sadat as the dawning of that time of peace. And Israel and Egypt, both today, are very heavily dependent on one another with regards to commerce and everything. So anyway, woe to the rebellious children, declares the Lord, who make plans which do not come from me, and make alliances not inspired by me, and so add sin to sin. They set out to go down to Egypt. And this refers most particularly to the thing that went on with Jeremiah when the Persians were invading, Babylonians rather, when the Babylonians were invading, Jeremiah warned that they needed to live a more faithful life and everything and follow God's law, and then that wouldn't happen, which the Jews didn't do. So they were invaded and taken over. And when the Babylonians left, they left some of their own people in charge and took a huge amount of Jews as slaves off to Babylon. Among them were Daniel, for instance, was a slave in Babylon. But when they went off to Babylon, the people that were left, God said were a remnant. And that remnant was in fact supposed to rebuild Israel. And they were supposed to do it by their being faithful to God's law, and so that the whole thing would be built up again. But what these people decided was they would be safer if they went off to Egypt. And so they would go to Egypt, and Jeremiah warned them against going to Egypt and everything. And when the group of them went to Egypt, they kidnapped Jeremiah. They took Jeremiah with them to Egypt. And in Egypt, Jeremiah either died or was killed. But they took him to Egypt this way. What they didn't understand, and they should have from their background, the Egyptians enslaved thousands of people. And because of the the racial difference, like the Egyptians don't look like rest of the Arabs, okay? The Egyptians have a specific look to them. And so the Egyptians found it easy to enslave. It's easy to enslave people who look differently than yourself, because then you can pick out the slaves in the society. So they would do that. But anyway, when they went down to Egypt, they ended up, just like the first time they went to Egypt, enslaved. So he says, without consulting me, to go take refuge in Pharaoh's protection, to shelter in Egypt's shadow. And the reason God did not want them in Egypt is because of the proliferation of gods in Egypt. The Jews were very, very prone to fall into pagan worship. And in Egypt, everything was a god. They worshipped everything. Pharaoh's protection will be your shame. The shelter of Egypt's shadow will be your humiliation. And the idea here is that to be very careful what you rely on. You know that if you go on trial and let's say, that you go through the trial and you're honest and all that sort of thing, whether or not you win the trial, you have the thing of integrity that would give you this, they have a sense of integrity, whether the trial comes off good or bad or not. I don't know how many of you have ever served on a jury, but once you serve on a jury once, you think a court's a pretty capricious place. But the idea is that if you're on trial, you really can't control the outcome of the court because it's in the hands of these jurors. But you can preserve your own integrity. And the idea is what can you preserve in these things? And he says, if you go into the shadow of Pharaoh's protection, everything, you will not preserve your integrity. You just won't. He says, Pharaoh's protection will be your shame, the shelter of Egypt's shadow, your humiliation. For his nobles have gone to Zoan, and his messengers have reached Hanes. But everyone has been disappointed by a people who cannot help, who bring neither aid nor profit, but only shame and disgrace. Egypt, at this point, was relying on its past, what do you want to call it, superiority. So when you went to Egypt, you saw these great monuments and everything, and you thought Egypt was much more powerful than it was. But Egypt would make these treaties with the different countries, and these countries would then be obliged to help Egypt when Egypt was in trouble, but Egypt would do nothing to help any of them when they got into trouble over a period of time. And I think like right now, an example kind of like that is in the United States, and I think it kind of began with Nixon, that a lot of places we make treaties with, like I'm thinking of Formosa, that we just abandon at the moment. And I think Biden is really trying to stand up to Putin about Ukraine, but we don't seem very committed to, really helping those things. And at one time, we were the nation that called it all over the world. If we said, if two nations started to go to war and we told them to make peace, they had to. They had to figure out a way to do it, But that kind of influence, we try and exercise it today, but people see us in the light of our past glory. We don't have the ability to do that as a nation anymore. He says, proclamation on the beasts of the Nageb. Okay, the Nageb is the desert, I think in Africa. It says, into the land of distress and of anguish, of lioness and roaring lion, of viper and flying dragon. They are bearing their riches on donkeys' backs, their treasures on camels' humps, to a nation that cannot help. So what he's describing now, they've decided they're going to go to Egypt. So what they do is they pack up all their belongings and they take them on the camels and they head through this very, very difficult desert to get to Egypt. And they don't go along the coast, but they go inland down through the Nageb. And when they are going, the dangers in the desert are, I should say the dangers in a desert are not as serious to someone who is used to living in the desert as it is to someone who isn't used to living in the desert. Like it's interesting to me that when you go over like the sand dunes and stuff in the desert there, that it looks like the ideal place not to wear shoes, but scorpions are everywhere there. Absolutely everywhere, and normally just under the sand because it's cooler under the sand than on the surface. And so there's that. And then the other thing are these, they're called pit vipers here, but they're called seraphs over there. And they're a snake that is extremely deadly, and they're all over. And the thing is, they're going through this area that they don't really understand. You remember when the Jews set out from Egypt, one of the things they were forbidden to do was eat shellfish. And I think you know Jews to this day don't eat clams, mussels, that sort of thing. And oftentimes if you talk to a rabbi about it, a rabbi would say they're forbidden to eat these because these are animals that purify the water. So while the animal is purifying the water, it's absorbing what it takes out of the water. But the fact of the matter is, the reason God forbid them was that they were in a land where they didn't eat any shellfish at all. And their temptation in their sojourn would be to eat shellfish. I think you know certain months shellfish are deadly. And they didn't know anything about that. So God forbade their foods. I think he forbade pork because it's the worst food in the world to try and transport. That you just don't transport it unless you don't make ham or something like that. But they didn't know that at that time. So God passed these things so that they could be safe. But here they aren't, because they're just going off on their own. He says, Egypt, whose help is vain and futile, so I will call her Rahab, who sits still. Rahab, who sits still. Rahab is one of the names they use for Egypt, but Rahab was, I think she was a servant of Sarah, and she didn't do anything. I mean, that was the thing, is she was ineffectual in anything. He says, now go, inscribe this on a tablet. Write it on a scroll in their presence, so that it may be a witness for time to come, forever and ever. Okay? And what he's saying is, you write this prophecy. He said, we'll tell them not to go into the desert, but they're going to do it anyway. So you want to write the prophecy down so that when they do it and the disasters threatened do occur, maybe next time they will know not to do it. Okay? So that the prophecy would work in two ways. It would tell them what's going to happen if they go now, but once the prophecy is fulfilled, then maybe the next generation will listen again. And I think I told you when we started Isaiah goes over a period of over 100 years. And so it sees the application. It's longer than the life of Isaiah. Isaiah founded a community of prophets. And so they continued the prophecy, and it's all under Isaiah's name. He says, this is a rebellious people, deceitful children who will not listen to the law of the Lord. And he wants Isaiah to know this so that Isaiah doesn't think something is wrong when they don't listen to him. Like if he gives God's message and no one listens to him, well, maybe he said it wrong or something like this. And that's not true at all. And remember, Jesus will do much with regards to the apostles. He says they're going to reject you, they'll do this, they'll do the other thing. And the danger is, if I get rejected, did I say the message wrong? No. In fact, if you were never rejected, the suspicion is maybe the message was wrong, because he says when you preach it, you'll be rejected. Okay? I probably have told you one time when I was in Hawaii, Billy Graham came over and stayed with us for a while. And one of the things Billy Graham said was the thing that really haunts him in his life is that he was so easily accepted by so many people. And you wonder maybe if that's, Anyway. He says, to the seers, they say, see nothing. And incidentally, the seers, the people had two kinds of inspiration, two major kinds. One major kind was auricular. God would speak to people. The second thing is that God would speak through visions. I guess the third one, God would speak through circumstances. He did that to Jeremiah, and then explain the circumstances. So, but they are different. Anyway, the seers are the ones who saw visions. And so he says, see nothing. to the prophets, do not prophesy to us the truth. Tell us flattering things, have illusionary visions. So that they tell the prophet, just tell us things that agree with us. Okay, that's all we want to hear. We don't want to hear the rest of it at all. I think I mentioned in the United States, when the church first came to the United States, the Catholic Church, we had a system called the Trustee System. And the Trustee System was every parish church belonged to the congregation. And they hired the priests they wanted and didn't hire the priests they didn't want. And this went on for a while. And I think the reason it was here was a large part of the founding of the United States was Protestants. And that's the way Protestant parishes are constructed. And so there was this called Trustee System. And the Pope became very alarmed by it. And the reason why he was alarmed by it was because they tended to hire priests. Like, for instance, if you were in a state that had slavery, you did not want a priest who was preaching against slavery, because everyone in the congregation had slaves and that sort of stuff. And so at a certain point, I don't know where it is, it was announced that no priest would be appointed to any parish, any new priest. Like, so if you had the priest now, that's fine. But no new priest would be appointed to any parish until the parish was turned over to the bishop, that belonged to the bishop, okay? And the reason is that all the bishops are appointed by the Pope. So he's able to do this. And I think I told you when I had to do a retreat in Tallahassee, Pensacola. And I think the original diocese was Pensacola. But anyway, in that area, and that is about as redneck, I mean, that's more Alabama than Alabama. But in that area, when you go up there, there's only one black priest in the diocese, and it's the bishop. And it's interesting, if you go in the bishop's office, there's a huge photograph over the bishop's desk, which of the first bishop of that diocese and his slaves. When he came over as bishop, they gave him, I think, 6 slaves to help in his household and stuff. And so they were photographed with him in the picture. So the bishop, if like you have a really redneck diocese, the Pope will always appoint a black bishop, you know. And if you have the reverse thing, like in South Africa, they appointed white bishops to the black areas and black bishops to the white areas. And that's just the way the church operates. Anyway, he says, turn aside from the way, leave the right path, rid us of the Holy One of Israel. And what he's saying is, if you'll stop saying these things, we can get rid of God, okay? That we don't have to listen to him and this sort of thing. And I oftentimes think of it in terms of a doctor. You know, I have friends of mine that do things like that all the time. Like they will not go to the doctor till they lose a necessary weight, and because they don't want the doctor telling them to lose weight, so they want to lose weight before they see the doctor, although they need the doctor while they have the weight problem, you know. And another example of that in Louisiana, my dad had a second marriage. My dad's wife, they lived in Louisiana, and she would always clean the entire house before the housekeeper came each week, that she didn't want the housekeeper to find the house a mess. Reminds me of that kid, you see that commercial for one of the detergents for dishes? They're washing the dishes, and the kid says, well, what exactly does the dishwasher do? Anyway, he says, now go inscribe this on a tablet, write it on a scroll in their presence. Now he says, so the Holy One of Israel says this, since you have rejected the word and put your trust in a perverse oppressor, relying on him, this guilt will be for you a breach and on the verge of collapse, a bulge in the top of a wall, which all at once and suddenly comes crashing down. This bulge in a wall is much like we get in the mission very frequently. It's actually caused by a kind of fungus or something in the wall, and it'll cause the plaster outside to bulge. And what you have to do is you have to go in, dry it out, and then replaster it and that sort of thing. But the idea, he says, that when we don't listen to God, we actually set up the thing for our destruction again. And I think in Israel, you really see this in the law that had all sorts of rules that helped in ecology, they helped in social justice, they had very serious laws about all this kinds of thing. We would be, I think, well advised to follow their kosher stuff. It'd probably be much healthier for us. He says, its shattering will be like an earthen pot, ruthlessly smashed to pieces, so that not one shard of its fragments can be found for taking the fire from the hearth or scooping water from the storage well. When you had a large pot break, I think pots were very expensive at the time, and so you would use the pieces. If you had a piece of the base, you would use that to drink water, and if you clean the embers out of a fire, the way they used to make bread, they would put a lot of small pieces of wood in the oven, like the one we have in the patio there, and if you light that, you let it burn down. You don't let it go out because you want the thing hot. But then you take a shard and you pull all the coals out. You have to have something to pull them out with. And then you can put the bread in while it's hot, lock it up, and the bread will rise and cook. But the thing is that this will break into pieces so small, they aren't even useful for other things. And he's comparing Egypt's protection to this. Egypt not only will not protect you, it will not be good for anything at all, okay? So, he says, for Lord God, the Holy One of Israel, says this, your salvation lay in conversion and tranquility, okay? Conversion and tranquility, what's that? Conversion is we convert to God and we rest in peace with what God's giving us. The tranquility is to be able to accept it peacefully. I guess the example I would give is that if you know that something can be dealt with, but it's with something very difficult. Let's say as an adult, when I had the opportunity to get the COVID shot, I got the COVID shot. No one likes shots less than I do because of my experience in the hospital with polio. But no one likes shots less than I do. But I understand the benefit of it. So even though it's something I don't like and everything, I do it in tranquility. Now, when you take a child to a doctor to get a shot, there is no tranquility. The child can't, and it doesn't hurt the child, I think, any less than it hurts you. It's just that, the child cannot sort of integrate the fact that this is the path to something good, okay? And he says that we should accept this is the law of God and do it in tranquility. And I think an example of this would be in the trial of Thomas More. When Thomas More was being tried, one of the things they did was threaten him with execution by hung, drawn, and quartered, which was actually what he was sentenced to. The king commuted it to a beheading, but he was sentenced to hung, drawn, and quartered. And in the courtroom, they threatened him with that if he did not approve Henry VIII's marriage. And Thomas More looked at the judge and he says, "That's a children's game." He says, "You can't play that with me." And the idea is he had tranquility in the will of God. So he says, "I know what I'm supposed to do. I'm going to do it. I don't care. What you do is your problem, but I know what I'm supposed to do." And I think there's an amazing thing to be able to somehow, to accept God's law and tranquility, that, things that need to be done. And I think a place where you would see this in more people's lives is in parenting. There are a lot of very difficult things, but there's not a discussion, that you're parenting the child. So that's what you do, You can't just leave them in the same diaper for a month. People talk. They can smell them a mile away, okay? So anyway, he says, your strength in serenity and trust. Your strength is in serenity and trust, but you would have none of it. So he says your strength really stands in this serenity, which is the same thing as tranquility, in your serenity and trust. You trust that the information God gives you is for your own good. And I think, as children, I would look at my own life that as a child, what your parents tell you, you just presume it's right, Like if and I've told you, like my dad tells me to jump off the garage roof because he's going to catch me, I jump. You just presume. And we should have this tranquility with God, that we sort of hear it, we know what we're supposed to do, and that's all. One of the things that they tell us in philosophy, that when Adam and Eve ate of the apple, they came to the knowledge of good and evil. And before that, they only had knowledge of the good. They had no knowledge of the evil. So you and I, that's part of the thing. Like anytime I look at a decision, I see both the good and the bad. And then I have to make a choice. But before the fall of Adam and Eve, you never saw the evil, and you never had to make a choice. Everything went so simply like this. And to come into, let's say, communion with God's law can have the same thing happen today, so that you and I can sort of enter into it and just trust it and go on with it. He says, your strength in serenity and trust, but you would have none of it. No, you said, we'll flee on horses, then flee you shall. And again, we shall ride on swift ones, and so your pursuers shall be swift. So he says, you'll ride on, but your pursuers will be swift. The pursuers, incidentally, are the Babylonians, who didn't want to see them escape. And the Egyptians will sort of accept them into Egypt, and the Babylonians will stop, but then they end up enslaved there. So it was a bad deal. It says, 1,000 will flee at the threat of one. At the threat of 5 you will flee, until you are left like a flagstaff on a mountaintop, like a signal on a hill. And the idea here is that having the force come against you, that there'll be no proportion between the force. You will be terrified by whatever comes. There may be smaller groups and this sort of thing. And the final comparison to the signal or the flagstaff is that the way they used to communicate between cities was by fires on the top of a mountain. You'd have a series of these things done. And again, if you've ever visited the Great Wall of China, you remember that these towers are put individually, and that was for fires. And if you would go inland from the what do you call it, the Great Wall, or rather out from China. If you go out, probably about a mile out, you find a duplicate tower. And they were the ones who were, when the enemy was coming, they would light those towers. Then you'd light these others long before the enemy reached you, and everyone would know, and this sort of thing. But the idea is then you've abandoned it, so the fire's there, but you've left. The same thing with the flagpole, that it is a, they used to do flags in some parts of the world where the flag would signal one way or another. I think you know that that was eventually taken over by ships, so that you can read a ship's flags if you know what they mean. And you can read them just like a language. Okay? So we'll stop there. It picks up nicer next. It's a promise of God's mercy. But today wasn't very nice. We will start in chapter 30 and verse 18.